On Easter Monday, 1883, a crowd stood in the cold outside a white stone house on Fifth Avenue and waited to watch strangers arrive dressed as kings. Inside, the woman who had built the house was dressed as a painting. 1,200 invitations had gone out. Barely 700 people came, and the woman receiving them had not spent a fortune on a party. She had spent it on a piece of paper. Alva Vanderbilt wanted one thing in New York that money could not buy, and 12 years later she would take the same instrument that won it for her and turn it on her own daughter in a house by the sea, with a guard posted at the door. 31 years after that, under oath, in a court in Rome, she told them exactly what she had done. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. There is a great deal more of this life to come, and almost none of it is the version you have heard. Chapter 1. A mother throws a ball and nobody comes. In Mobile, Alabama, before the war, a woman named Phoebe Smith gave costly parties and could not get the town to attend them. The record is blunt about it. Her entertainments were costly, but not popular parties. There is one account of a ball at which no member of Mobile's elite arrived at all. The house was ready. The rooms were lit. Nobody came. That woman had a daughter, born in Mobile on the 17th of January, 1853, and named Alva Erskine Smith. She was the seventh of 9 children, 4 of whom died as infants. She was named after a Scottish judge, James Erskine, Lord Alva, an uncle of her great-grandmother, which is a strange piece of inheritance for a girl who would become the loudest American woman of her century. The family lived in a house on Government Street, a Gothic block of stone with a castellated roofline and Tudor arches, wide halls and casement windows, magnolias in the yard, and a separate bathhouse built of marble. It was demolished in 1930, 3 years before she died. The money and the standing came from her mother's side. Phoebe Ann Desher was the daughter of Robert Desher, who had served as a captain in the 24th Regiment of United States Infantry in the War of 1812, was breveted major, and then sat in Congress as a representative from Tennessee from 1827 to 1831. He declined renomination and moved to Mobile, which is the entire reason the Smiths were in Alabama at all. His brother, Alva's great-uncle, was Joseph Desher, who served 6 consecutive terms in Congress and then became the 9th governor of Kentucky. Alva's father, Murray Forbes Smith, was born in Virginia and trained as a lawyer before going into cotton on his father-in-law's recommendation. That detail matters more than it looks. He was a cotton commission merchant, and the interests he managed were the Kentucky Desher family's interests. His business was built on his wife's family's capital and his wife's family's connections. It was relational, it was Southern, and it was entirely a creature of the world before the war. The family owned slaves. Alva's grandfather owned slaves. When the Smiths later moved north, her mother brought enslaved workers with her. And here the record produces the earliest documented statement of the thing that would define Alva Vanderbilt's whole life. Late in her life, she dictated her memories to a ghostwriter, and among them was a recollection of an enslaved boy named Monroe Crawford. "I managed the situation," she said. "I wanted my own way, and with Monroe, I got it. I bossed him. It was a case of absolute control on my part." She was recalling her childhood. She was describing, without apparent discomfort, the formation of her own will inside the machinery of slavery. It is the first time in the record that she names the thing she wanted, and the word she chose was control. Around 1859, before the war, the Smiths left Mobile for New York and settled for a time at Madison Square. They were Southerners in a northern city, and for a few years that was survivable. It stopped being survivable in April of 1865. After Lincoln was shot, the feeling against Southern families in New York became so hostile that Murray Forbes Smith sold the family's Fifth Avenue house and moved his business to Liverpool the following year. The family split. The father went to England to keep the cotton trade alive. The mother took the children to Paris. They rented an apartment on the Champs-Élysées and stayed 4 years. Alva was 13 when they arrived. She was sent briefly to a boarding school run by a Mademoiselle Coulon at Neuilly, outside the city, and she did not last there long because her temperament proved unmanageable. What she did instead was look at buildings. She went out to the chateau of the Loire Valley and to Versailles again and again, and she sketched them obsessively. Every house she would later build on Fifth Avenue, at Newport, on Long Island, comes out of those 4 years and those sketchbooks. She never forgave America for being the alternative. "I was broken-hearted that I must leave France," she said afterward. "I was in sympathy with everything there. America struck me in contrast to France, as crude and raw." She was 16 when they went home. The family that came back was not the family that had left. The cotton trade had reorganized itself around new methods and new men, and Murray Forbes Smith could not or would not adapt to them. His daughter's account of it is loyal and clear-eyed at once. "He could not stoop to the new methods which to him seemed underhand," she said. "His inability to meet these changes resulted in a great change in our circumstances." That is a daughter defending her father's honor and diagnosing his obsolescence in the same breath, and it is the beginning of everything. But before the money ran out, there was a lesson closer to home, and Alva had already watched it happen. Her mother had put on the finest parties in Mobile at real expense, and the people she wanted had stayed away. Money had been spent, rooms had been lit, invitations had gone out, and nobody had come. Chapter 2. The family falls through a city, one address at a time. Between 1869 and 1873, the Smiths lived at 3 New York addresses, and each one was smaller than the last. The first was 45th Avenue, a house valued at somewhere between $25,000 and $39,000, which was a respectable address for a family with a name. The second, by 1870, was 14 West 33rd Street. The third was 21 West 44th Street. 3 houses in about 4 years, each one a step down, tracked through the city like a fever chart. There is no more concrete evidence of what happened to that family than the changing numbers on their letters. A fall like that was not hunger. The Smiths did not starve. What they lost was something narrower and, in the world Alva was being raised for, more total. They lost the ability to be visited. A family that keeps moving to smaller houses stops being a family that other families call upon. And in New York, in the 1870s, being called upon was the whole of a woman's public existence. Her father talked, at some point in those years, about the possibility of taking in boarders. Whether the Smiths ever actually let rooms is not settled by any surviving record, and the story has been repeated far more confidently than the evidence allows. What is documented is that the phrase was used inside the house. A man of that background, in that decade, said out loud to his children that they might have to keep a boarding house. For a girl of 16, that sentence would have done its work, whether or not it ever came true. Then, in 1871, her mother died. Phoebe Smith was 48. The cause was severe rheumatoid arthritis, which in that period meant years of pain before the end. Alva was 18. There is a story that at her mother's coffin, she swore to save the family from ruin. It is a good story, and it may be true, but it comes from Alva's own dictated memoir, and nothing corroborates it, so it belongs in the same drawer as everything else she said about herself late in life. what is documented is colder and better. Her mother's death triggered a mandatory year of mourning, and a year of mourning in 1871 meant a year off the marriage market. The family's one remaining asset was an 18-year-old daughter, and the custom of the day put that asset in a black dress and took her out of circulation for 12 months at precisely the moment she was most needed. By the early 1870s, things had gone from bad to worse. What she took out of those years was not a feeling. It was a rule, and she stated it plainly. "You cannot help your children to advantages through sentimental romance," she said, "but through money, which alone has power." Read that sentence twice, because it will be back. It is a conclusion drawn by a teenage girl in a rented house, and she would apply it to her own daughter 24 years later, without ever appearing to notice that she had become the thing that had happened to her. The rescue came through a friend. Consuelo Iznaga was born in New York in the same year as Alva, the daughter of a Cuban diplomat whose family owned sugar mills near Trinidad, and of a woman from a Louisiana plantation. She was Alva's closest friend from childhood, and around 1873, at a party thrown in Consuelo's honor, she introduced Alva to a young man named William Kissam Vanderbilt. He was the second son of William Henry Vanderbilt and the grandson of the Commodore. And in 1873, he was not a rich man. He was a rich man's expectation. The Commodore was alive and still held the fortune in his own hands. They were married on the 20th of April, 1875, at Calvary Church on Gramercy Park. Consuelo Iznaga was a bridesmaid. Alva was 22, and she was marrying, quite consciously, a prospect rather than a possession. Her father died 14 days later. He never saw whether it worked. He lived just long enough to walk his daughter up an aisle, and then he was gone. And the family that had come north from Mobile with enslaved servants and a congressman's name behind it ended in a rented house on West 44th Street, with one asset successfully deployed. And there was one thing that survived the collapse intact. Phoebe Smith had been married in a veil trimmed with a piece of Brussels lace, point d'Angleterre, fine enough to be worth keeping through a war, a bankruptcy, a flight to Europe, and 3 descending addresses. Alva wore it at Calvary Church. 20 years later, at a wedding that 200 policemen would be needed to control, her own daughter would wear it too. Chapter 3. A white house rises on a brown street. The Vanderbilts had one of the great fortunes in America and could not get a card left at their door. To understand what Alva was about to do, it is necessary to understand the machine she was standing outside of, because it was far more specific than snobbery and far more effective. It ran on 3 mechanisms, and all 3 were designed to be unanswerable. The first was a committee. 25 gentlemen of New York, known as the Patriarchs, ran 3 subscription balls at Delmonico's every year, and their invitation lists determined who belonged. Behind them stood one woman. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor was descended from the Dutch settlers who had built the city, and the Astor money came from fur and Manhattan real estate, which is to say, it was old by 2 full generations. Her calling cards were printed with 3 words: the Mrs. Astor. She held that vulgar wealth alone was not permitted to set the social agenda, and that the proper task of society was to harness money, tame its owners, and teach them how to behave. Alva's own biographer put her attitude to the family Alva had just married into exactly. Mrs. Astor regarded the Vanderbilts as just the sort of people New York should rally round to exclude. The second mechanism was the calling card, and this one is the key to everything that follows. In that world, a family did not exist socially until an established hostess had left her card at their door. No card meant no acquaintance. No acquaintance meant no invitation could be issued or accepted in either direction, because there was formally no one there to invite. Refusing to call was a denial of existence, in the most literal sense the word allows. It cost the refuser nothing, it could be denied if challenged, and there was no procedure by which the excluded family could force the issue. Which is why Alva did not spend the next decade trying to get invited anywhere. She spent it working out how to force a card. The third mechanism was the opera. The Academy of Music on 14th Street had 18 boxes, and they passed from parent to child. They were the gate to the winter season. The new families were kept out, and the record shows just how absolutely there are accounts of new money offering as much as $30,000 for a single Academy box, which is around $1 million today, and being firmly refused. The scale of what these people actually had is worth holding still for a moment. In January of 1877, 2 years after Alva's wedding, the Commodore died and left an estate of about $105 million. Roughly 95% of it, about $100 million, went to his eldest son, William Henry. His 8 daughters received $500,000 apiece. His grandsons, including Alva's husband, divided $5 million between them. $105 million in 1877 is something on the order of $3 billion in modern consumer prices. 8 daughters of the richest man in America got $500,000 each, and the whole cohort of grandsons split what one daughter of a duke would later be settled with. So on the day the exclusion was at its sharpest, William Kissam Vanderbilt was not the possessor of one of the world's great fortunes. He was a young man with a portion of a $5 million pool, a job inside the New York Central system, and a father willing to pay for things. And what Alva did with that was build a house. She hired Richard Morris Hunt, the first American architect trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and between 1879 and the opening months of 1883, they put up a French chateau on the northwest corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. It cost somewhere around $3 million, roughly $93 million today, and the house was built on William Henry Vanderbilt's money as much as his son's, to a design his daughter-in-law was driving. She was not a client. She and Hunt collaborated, and the sauce she brought to the table was the Loire Valley she had sketched as a homesick girl of 14. It had about 60 rooms across 4 floors. The grand hall ran 60 feet, floored with stone from Normandy and walled in carved Caen stone. There were 2 great drawing rooms, one in the style of Francis I, wainscoted in carved French walnut and hung in dark red plush, and one in the manner of Louis XV, to panel which an actual French chateau was stripped and shipped over. Gobelin tapestries a century old hung on the walls. A painting by Paul Baudry filled the ceiling with the marriage of Cupid and Psyche. There was a banquet hall 50 feet by 35, 2 stories high, that seated 40. Alva's writing desk had belonged to Marie Antoinette, but the thing that made the house an argument rather than a residence was the outside of it. A period writer named James McCabe had described 5th Avenue a few years earlier, and his description is the whole point. The principal material used in the construction of the buildings on the avenue is brownstone, he wrote. This gives to the street a sombre look. And of Mrs. Astor's own house at 35th Street, McCabe wrote this: At the northwest corner of 35th Street is a plain dwelling of brick with light stone trimmings. Alva faced her house in grey Indiana limestone and roofed it in blue-grey slate trimmed with copper. White stone on a brown street, visible from 3 blocks off, and unmissable to anybody travelling down 5th Avenue toward a plain dwelling of brick. By the first months of 1883, the house was finished. The tapestries were up, The Caen stone was in. The chateau that had been stripped in France was reassembled in a drawing room on Fifth Avenue, and a portrait of the mistress of the house by the painter Madrazo hung over a chimney-piece where the guests would have to pass beneath it. And in a city where nobody had ever left a card at her door, Alva Vanderbilt sat down and ordered 1,200 invitations. Chapter 4. She picks the one night nobody can refuse. Easter Sunday fell on the 25th of March that year, which made the following night the first legitimate night of the season for dancing. That is the first thing to understand about the ball, and almost nobody says it. Lent ended on Easter Sunday. Society did not dance during Lent. By setting her party on Easter Monday, Alva Vanderbilt chose the one date in the calendar on which a refusal could not be blamed on the church, on mourning, or on the season. Anyone who stayed away was staying away from her. The second thing she did was borrow a title. Consuelo Isnaga, the friend who had introduced her to her husband, had married Viscount Mandeville in 1876 and was now Lady Mandeville. The ball was given in her honour, and she stood in the receiving line beside the hostess all evening, which is exactly what a guest of honour did. The strategy inside that arrangement is the cleverest thing Alva ever devised. Mrs. Astor could snub a railroad family. She could not comfortably snub a British viscountess. Alva had borrowed the one commodity that New York's old guard could neither manufacture nor refuse, and she had borrowed it from her oldest friend. The invitations went out, and for a month the city talked about nothing else. A single dressmaker made more than 150 gowns for that one night, and kept 140 seamstresses working day and night for weeks, at $500 to $700 a dress, which is $15,000 to $22,000 apiece today. The New York Times reported afterward, in a line that has outlived everything else it printed that week, that the ball had agitated New York society more than any social event in many years, and that businessmen found their minds haunted by uncontrollable thoughts about what to wear. On the night itself, the crowd began forming outside 660 Fifth Avenue soon after dark. The Tribune's reporter watched them come. A great multitude of persons to whom, plainly, the habits of high-class society were unknown, he wrote, began to gather in front of Mr. Vanderbilt's house soon after nightfall. There were young men and old, giddy girls and sedate matrons, widows in weeds and babies in arms. They stood in the March cold to watch other people go into a building. A temporary canopy had been raised over the entrance, lit with Chinese lanterns. Florists had worked since early morning. The balustrades of the grand staircase were buried in roses and vines. Masses of rare roses filled the dining room. In the ballroom, the musicians played from inside a bower of roses. 25 uniformed police officers were posted at the entrance. Plain-clothes detectives patrolled near the windows. They were watching for dynamite. The Sun's front page report the following morning opens by noting that the ball was gorgeously accomplished last night, with no interruption by dynamite. For a newspaper to lead with, that means the threat was public knowledge in New York before the party started. The most famous evening in the history of American society was staged under a bomb threat, in a decade when a great deal of American money was frightened of the people it had been taken from, and the first sentence anyone read about it the next morning was that nobody had blown it up. The carriages started arriving at 10. Inside, the third-floor gymnasium had been turned into a forest, with palm trees draped in bougainvillea and orchids. The hostess stood in the receiving line dressed as a Venetian princess, in a costume copied from a painting by the French academic painter Alexandre Cabanel. The underskirt was white and yellow brocade, shading from deep orange to the lightest canary. The flowers and leaves outlined in gold, white, and iridescent beads. The train was light blue satin, embroidered in gold and lined with Roman red almost its entire length. caught up at one side into a great puff. The sleeves were transparent gold tissue. On her head, she wore a Venetian cap covered in jewels, and set into it the detail that led every costume description printed in America that week, a peacock worked in many coloured gems. She had costumed herself as a painting. Beside her, Lady Mandeville received in black. Her dress was copied from a Van Dyck portrait of a Princess de Croix, black satin embroidered in jet, black velvet body and sleeves under an immense collar, and drooping plumes blazing with jewels. Nothing could have been more becoming to Lady Mandeville's blonde beauty, one reporter wrote, than this magnificent and sombre dress. Light against dark, staged, two women receiving side by side, and the newspapermen noticed and said so. The costumes around them were a catalogue of the era's appetite. Alva's husband came as the Duke de Guise in yellow silk tights and a black velvet cloak embroidered in gold, copied from a painting hanging in his own father's art gallery. He had made himself into an object from the family collection. His brother, Cornelius, came as Louis XVI, with a diamond-hilted sword. Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of the house, came as a 13th-century Florentine painter. One guest came as a wasp, with antennae made of diamonds. Alva's own sister came as a peacock, the bodice made from a real peacock's breast, and had the excruciating experience of finding that another woman had had the same idea. Miss Work came as Joan of Arc in a cuirass and gauntlets of solid silver mail with spurs of steel. The young Duc de Morny wore court dress with buttons made of red diamonds, rubies and sapphires. And Miss Kate Fearing-Strong, who was known as Puss, came as a cat, wearing a taxidermied white cat's head as a hat with 7 cattails sewn onto her skirt. The image most people have seen from that night is a young woman with a dead cat on her head. Alva's sister-in-law Alice, married to Cornelius, came as the electric light. The dress was by Charles Frederick Worth of Paris, yellow satin worked with glass pearls and beads in a lightning bolt pattern, threaded through with gold and silver. It contained a battery. She could raise a bulb above her head, like the Statue of Liberty, whose torch had been on public display in Madison Square, and whose body would not be dedicated for another 3 years. It is the one dress from that night that survives, and it sits today in the Museum of the City of New York, given by Alice's youngest daughter in 1951. At a little after 11, Gilmore's band struck up in the gymnasium and the 6 quadrilles formed. The running order had been drawn by lot 2 days earlier. Only the opening was fixed in advance, and the opening set had been granted, by common consent, the privilege of filling the scene for 5 minutes and no more. Nearly 100 ladies and gentlemen assembled in the gymnasium and began to move down the grand stairway in procession. It had been agreed in advance that the hobby horse set would open and be allowed the floor for 5 minutes and no longer. On the night the plan slipped, and the ball actually opened with Mother Goose. The horses came next. The hobby horse riders sat on life-size animals covered in genuine hides, with bright eyes and flowing manes and tails, light enough to be strapped to the dancers' waists. Their real feet, hidden under richly embroidered hangings and false legs, painted on the outside of the blankets, so that the deception was quite perfect. Workmen had taken 2 months to build them. The riders wore red hunting coats and yellow satin knee breeches in the style of Louis XIV. After them came an opera buffet, set organised by Alva's own sister, and a Dresden china quadrille danced in all-white court costume like living porcelain, and a go-as-you-please set organised by Alice in her lightning dress. And the 4th set was the Star Quadrille, in which the ladies were dressed as twin stars in yellow, blue, mauve and white, and the gentlemen in the costume of Henri II. It had been organised by Mrs. Astor. The procession wound down through the crowd of princesses and monks and cavaliers and highlanders and queens and dairymaids and bullfighters and brigands across the Normandy stone of the Great Hall, through the Francis I room with its vast carved cabinets and its immense fireplace, into the Louis XV salon where the century-old gobelins hung. And there, over the chimney-piece, was the portrait of Alva. 100 costumed millionaires filed underneath a painting of the hostess on their way to the ballroom. There is no reason to think that was an accident. Supper was served in the gymnasium a little after 1. The food came from the combined kitchens of the Vanderbilt households, with the ices and pastry supplied by Delmonico's. No menu survives, which is itself a fact worth keeping, and which somebody noticed at the time. They danced until it was light. The last thing anyone did, at 4 in the morning or later, was a Virginia reel, led by Alva. She had thrown a ball in a city that had refused to acknowledge her existence, on the one night when no excuse would hold, and about 700 people had come. She had also, though nobody knew it yet, been writing the story of it for a month. Chapter 5. The papers all print the same words. 4 days after the ball, a Massachusetts newspaper worked out that every account of it in America had been written by the same hand. The piece ran in the Springfield Weekly Republican on the 30th of March, under the heading, "The Greatest Social Event," and it is the sharpest thing anybody wrote about the Gilded Age in the week the Gilded Age got its picture taken. The reporters had done their duty toward it by some mysterious means, the paper wrote. Whether they mingled in the festivities where costume was required, or were concealed among the musicians, or enrolled in the culinary forces, or were merely allowed to go through the house in the early evening hours and then were furnished expert lists of the costumes. Which of these privileges was theirs we cannot tell. The last supposition is the most probable, however, since while the descriptions of the affair are brilliant, with glittering generalities and tentative statements, the costumes are described in identical order and language by all the papers, while the supper is not mentioned at all by any of them, though the supper room is described by 1 or 2. Read that slowly, because it is a piece of media criticism written in 1883 that turns out to be correct. The costumes appear in the same order, in the same words, in every paper. Nobody describes the food, because none of the reporters were there when it was served. They had been walked through an empty house in the early evening and handed a list. The lists survive in Cheyenne and Richmond and Fort Benton and Salt Lake City, and they are near verbatim matches of one another. The wire carried the ball to a steamboat town on the upper Missouri within 12 days, in full costume detail. It reached Astoria, Oregon, and Carson City, Nevada, where within a week it had become a joke. A tramp was picked up here yesterday, the Morning Appeal reported, trying to sell a ticket for the Vanderbilt ball at a ridiculously low figure. He was quite surprised when told that the ball was all over. Within a month, the party had become a product. Alva had thrown the most famous social event in American history, and she had also written the copy for it, distributed it in advance, and let a continent print her version under its own bylines. In the weeks before the ball, she had invited newsmen in, allowed the house to be photographed, and described the design elements to them herself. Her own historical society calls it her most significant early publicity venture, and the beginning of a 40-year campaign of orchestrating newsworthy activities. Now the money, because the famous number is wrong, and the way it is wrong, is the most interesting thing about it. The figure everybody quotes is $250,000. It came from the New York World and went out on the wires on the 28th of March, and it can still be read in the Salt Lake Herald the following day under the wonderfully sour headline, "Only a Snide Affair." The dispatch first knocks down the wild rumors. That upwards of $1 million was expended is entirely erroneous, it says. The story that $20,000 went on flowers alone is corrected down to about $10,000. Then it gives the arithmetic, and the arithmetic is where the myth dies. The World was calculating what it called the society outlay of the Vanderbilt ball. It priced the costumes at $155,730, the flowers at $11,000, carriage hire $4,000, hairdressing $4,000. Then, separately, the host's own costs, supper and extra servant hire at about $25,000, extra flowers at about $10,000, and it added the whole thing up and said that altogether the ball cost not less than $250,000, which it did. But look at whose money it was. The largest single line in that total, $155,730 of costumes, was spent by the guests, on themselves, in their own dressmakers' shops. So were the carriages and the hairdressing. The Vanderbilt's own outlay, on the World's own numbers, comes to somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000. Godey's magazine, working independently that year, put the whole thing at $50,000 and observed that this was equivalent to the president's annual salary, which lands remarkably close to the same place. The most extravagant party in American history was a $250,000 party in which most of the money belonged to other people. And the attendance is wrong too. The Sun's report on the morning of the 27th is unambiguous. 1,200 invitations had been issued, and up to midnight, perhaps 700 guests had arrived. The Tribune put it at 600 to 800. The Springfield Republican counted 800. A correspondent writing from New York 5 days later for a Maryland paper was blunter. Of the 1,200 invited guests, about 500 did not come. 500 empty places. Modern museums still say 1,200 people attended. 4 separate newspapers who were there in the same week say between 600 and 800. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Mrs. Astor came. Mrs. Astor organized a quadrille, which is a level of participation that would have been unimaginable a year before. Ward McAllister came. The exclusion ended, and it ended in public. The famous story of how it happened is another matter entirely. The tale goes that Carrie Astor, Mrs. Astor's youngest daughter, had been rehearsing the Star Quadrille with her friends, that the friends received invitations and Carrie did not, that Alva explained she could hardly invite a young woman whose mother had never called on her, and that Mrs. Astor was therefore obliged to send her footman to leave a card at 665th Avenue, after which Carrie's invitation arrived the following day. It has been told for 140 years. It appears in no newspaper of 1883. Carrie Astor is not named in a single period source. The Wire dispatch credits the Star Quadrille to her mother. No date was ever fixed for the calling card. Every modern account cites another modern account, and the chain does not terminate in any document from that year. At least one museum flatly describes it as apocryphal, and the likeliest original source for it is Alva herself, which is a problem because her own biographer has caught her inventing a family box at the Academy of Music that the Smiths never had. So the honest version is this. Mrs. Astor came, and she ran a quadrille, and that fact is beyond dispute. The story of how she was made to come may be exactly what happened. It may also be what Alva Vanderbilt wanted remembered. Henry Clews was in the room that night, dressed as Louis XIV, and 4 years later he published the best assessment anybody has managed. The ball, he wrote, seemed to have the effect of levelling up among the social ranks of upper tendom, and placing the Vanderbilts at the top of the heap in what is recognized as good society in New York. Levelling up. Notice what he does not say. he does not say the Astors fell. Mrs. Astor went on ruling New York society for another 25 years, until her death in 1908. Ward McAllister's list of the 400 was not even published until 1892, 9 years after the ball, and it was Mrs. Astor's authority that gave the list its meaning. What the ball did was force an admission, and 7 months later, when the Metropolitan Opera opened its first season on the 22nd of October, with 122 boxes against the Academy's 18, and Mrs. Astor abandoned 14th Street for the new house, the admission turned into a surrender. The party and the opera war were the same campaign. The party came first. Chapter 6. A woman recognizes her own livery on another woman's carriage. In 1894, driving in the Bois de Boulogne, Alva Vanderbilt passed a carriage more splendid than hers, whose servants wore what she thought at first was her own uniform. 11 years separate that afternoon from the ball, and in those 11 years she got everything the ball had been for. In 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt died and left an estate of nearly $200 million, the fortune having doubled in under 9 years. The bulk went to his 2 eldest sons. Alva's husband received $55 million, which is around $1.75 billion in modern consumer prices. The order of events inverts the way this story is usually told. The money arrived 2 years after the party. She had staged the most expensive evening in American history on the anticipation of a fortune, in a house her father-in-law was still alive to disapprove of. What she did with the money was build again, and this time she went to Newport and built next door. Marble House went up on Bellevue Avenue between 1888 and 1892. Richard Morris Hunt again, modelled on the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the pavilion Marie Antoinette had used to get away from her own court. The commonly quoted cost is $11 million, of which $7 million went on the stone, though the museum that owns the house today publishes no figure at all, and the newspapers of the day said $1 million. What the museum does confirm is the material: 500,000 cubic feet of marble. 500,000 cubic feet of marble in a resort of wooden summer cottages run by 36 servants standing directly beside Beechwood. Beechwood was Mrs. Astor's house. On the 17th of January, 1892, Alva's 39th birthday, her husband gave her Marble House. Not the use of it, the house outright, in her own name. 2.5 years later, when the newspapers went to work on the marriage, they printed the fact twice in the same day, in 2 cities. The marble mansion at Newport is hers, and in her name, the Evening Star wrote. That William Vanderbilt gave her outright. Hold that fact. It becomes load-bearing. Because by then the marriage was finished, and everybody who had spent any time near it knew. In 1894, at Alva's suggestion, the Vanderbilts planned a 3-year cruise on their new yacht, the Valiant. The passenger list is a small masterpiece of bad judgment. The 3 children, a governess, a physician, a host of servants, and among the guests, one Oliver Hazard, Perry Belmont. The cruise lasted 3 months. A friend of the family gave a newspaper the flavour of life on board, and it is the single most revealing passage anybody ever wrote about that marriage. Mrs. Vanderbilt is a woman with a very strong will, he said. She objected to members of the yachting party going ashore and staying all night, or even later than 10 o'clock in the evening. When the gentlemen wanted to play poker, Mrs. Vanderbilt always insisted that one of them should stay out of the game to entertain. They used to cut the cards for the sacrifice. They drew lots to decide which man had to sit and talk to her. The same source added, dryly, that Mr. Vanderbilt did not like this conduct on the part of his wife. Others put it more plainly still. Mrs. Vanderbilt was too exacting, one of them said. She demanded too much of him, and he did not care to create a scandal if they could not agree. Newport's verdict, when the story finally broke, was a shrug. "Mr. and Mrs. Vanderbilt are totally unfit for each other," a resident told a reporter, "and for several years they have led an unhappy existence, disagreeing upon the most trivial matters. Yet Mrs. Vanderbilt is a clever, even brilliant woman, and a person who is well liked by many friends. Mr. Vanderbilt is a most agreeable man, with whole-souled ideas. And yet, upon matters unimportant as well as important, they failed to agree. And then a detail so exact, it does the whole marriage in one clause. He had failed to agree with her, the report noted, especially with his wife's idea of surrounding it with high, almost impenetrable walls. The real trouble aboard the Valiant was Belmont. There had been comment about the flirtation between Mrs. Vanderbilt and Oliver Belmont at Newport as far back as the summer of 1892, the first full season after Marble House opened, and the talk was general and unfavourable, and only the immense wealth of the family kept condemnation down. They were constantly together, one paper reported, and he was one of the few visitors admitted to the Marble House. By the time the Valiant reached the Mediterranean, Vanderbilt had accused a well-known clubman of abusing his hospitality by paying too much attention to his wife. There was a second quarrel. At Nice, there was a third, and the clubman left for America. The party broke up. Alva went to England, her husband went to Paris, and on the 17th of June at the Grand Prix, he won 40,000 francs on a race, was introduced almost immediately afterward to a woman named Nellie Neustretter, and handed her the entire winnings that evening. Friends remonstrated with him. He insisted. He then fitted out an establishment for her in Paris and gave her a house at Deauville with servants and every luxury she asked for. Nellie Neustretter was, by the best-sourced account, a girl from Eureka, Nevada, the daughter of a clothing store owner named Cohen, who had done well, educated at a seminary in California, married in 1884 to a man named Neustretter, and divorced by him 3 years later, and living since on the generosity of rich men in 2 hemispheres. She was a professional, and everybody in Paris knew it, and William Kissam Vanderbilt did not appear to care. One correspondent watched the American colony watching him and enjoyed himself enormously. "A queer figure, this newcomer in the lists of degeneracy cut," he wrote, "with his stolid, florid face, his quaint side whisker, his short, rather ungainly figure, his air of a blundering boy. They looked and winked and thrust their tongues in their cheeks. This staid-looking businessman of 45, turned suddenly gallant, was too much for their gravity. He did one thing more, and it was the thing that ended it. He allowed Nellie Neustretter's servants to wear the same livery as his wife's, which is how Alva Vanderbilt came to be driving through the Bois de Boulogne one afternoon in the summer of 1894 and to meet a carriage finer than her own, staffed by men in a uniform she recognized, because for one moment she thought it was hers. Soon Mrs. Vanderbilt, driving in the Bois, met a carriage more splendid than hers, the report ran, with servants in livery so like hers that at first glance she thought it was the same. And then she made some inquiries, and then she left her husband forever. In 1883, she had put her household's colours on the servants at the door of a house designed to be seen from 3 blocks away. 11 years later, she saw the same colours on somebody else's footman and understood exactly what her husband had spent the summer telling Paris. She went back to America and hired the best lawyer in the country. Chapter 7. A judge forbids a Vanderbilt to marry again. On the 5th of March, 1895, Justice George Barrett signed a decree that freed Alva Vanderbilt and left her husband legally unable to remarry while she lived. New York gave a wife almost nothing to work with, and what she did with that little is the measure of her. From 1787 until 1966, adultery was the only ground for absolute divorce in the state of New York. There was no cruelty, no desertion, no incompatibility. Everything that had happened on the Valiant, every indignity in front of guests, every cut card, was legally worth nothing at all. And the same statute barred divorce by consent, confession, or collusion, which meant a couple could not simply agree to end a marriage and tell a judge so. Put those two rules together, and a strange machine appears. To get out of a New York marriage, a wife needed her husband to commit real, provable adultery with a real third party, in a way that could be evidenced by somebody other than herself. Which is exactly what William Kissam Vanderbilt spent the summer of 1894 doing, in the most conspicuous manner available to a rich man in Paris, with a professional courtesan in his wife's livery. His own friends said so at the time. His attentions to Mademoiselle Neustretter, one paper reported, were inspired not by mere infatuation, but by a chivalrous wish to afford his wife an opportunity of divorcing him. Another was blunter. His relations with her were so openly paraded by him with the purpose of forcing his wife to take cognizance of them, it wrote. They assert that he had no affection for her, and was in no sense fascinated by her. And the livery itself, a third paper noted, was commented upon by everyone, and out of it grew the belief that Mr. Vanderbilt was only anxious to give his wife an easy chance to get a divorce from him. The one thing he ever publicly denied was the livery. He never denied the affair. Whether he hired her is unprovable and probably unknowable, and the case against it is real. The relationship carried on past the point of usefulness. She was installed in a villa at Monte Carlo as late as March of 1895, and in early February of that year, in the middle of the suit, she gave birth to a son. The liaison was genuine. What was manufactured was its visibility. She almost did not go through with it. In June of 1894, Cornelius Vanderbilt went to Paris and made every effort to bring about a reconciliation. He failed at everything except a temporary stopping of the proceedings. Then Alva fell ill with what the papers called nervous prostration, and during that illness it was understood that she had changed her mind about going to the courts and was willing to do anything to avoid the publicity of a divorce suit. Colonel and Mrs. William J., close friends of both husband and wife, spent some time trying to effect a reconciliation and did not meet with much success. She was talked out of it once. Then she went back. The summons was served on her husband in person, inside New York State, on the 3rd of January, 1895. He appeared through counsel and formally denied the adultery, which was the required theatre. A referee was appointed to hear the evidence, and on the 18th of January, he reported that the material allegations of the complaint were true, and that the defendant had been guilty of the acts of adultery charged. On the 5th of March, Justice Barrett granted the decree, and it was filed that afternoon. Alva Vanderbilt was the plaintiff. Her husband was the party adjudged guilty. That was the point, and it is why she had waited. The testimony was sealed, and Barrett went out of his way to explain that this was routine. The papers in divorce cases are not sealed by order of court, he told a reporter. On the contrary, it requires an order of court to unseal them. A rule of practice, not only in this court, but in the courts throughout the state, requires that the testimony in divorce cases be sealed. No favour had been bought. The only document the public could examine was the decree itself, which is why the newspapers filled the hole with the previous summer's Paris cables, and why no co-respondent was ever named in open court. Every line printed in March of 1895 that begins Nellie Neustretter is the woman in the case is a reporter's inference from August of 1894. There was no court-ordered alimony either. The decree records that the defendant tendered to the plaintiff a written instrument under his hand and seal, making provision for her and for the children, which the plaintiff accepted in lieu of other provisions, and that she thereupon waived and relinquished all her right and claim to have any such provision required to be made by this court. She took a private, sealed deed she had negotiated herself, and formally gave up her right to have a judge fix the number, which is why every figure ever attached to this divorce, $10 million, $3,300,000 a year, is a guess, and always will be. The one figure with any documentary status is her own opening demand from the previous August, $300,000 a year, custody of the children, and the 3 houses. She did not need the houses. Marble House had been hers, in her own name, for 3 years. She was negotiating from a position she had quietly secured 3 years earlier, and every reporter in New York wrote her up as a woman fighting for a roof. Then there was the cost. The Vanderbilts cut her completely. Cornelius and his family sailed for Liverpool 5 days before the decree. Chauncey Depew, cornered at Grand Central, refused to say a word beyond the fact that it had been granted, and would not say where she was. A reporter went round the family houses that week and got nowhere. At the mansion on 52nd Street, the butler was asked whether Mrs. Vanderbilt was at home. "Well," he replied, "who wants to know?" At Cornelius Vanderbilt's house, they said he was out of town. The same story was told at the other residences. Every Vanderbilt door in New York was shut, and Alva herself had disappeared. 2 of the standard explanations for what followed are simply impossible. Ward McAllister, who is supposed to have struck her from the 400 over the scandal, had died on the 31st of January, dining alone at the Union Club after a week of influenza, 5 weeks before the decree. He was, in any case, her ally, and she was not thrown down from grace because she had never been particularly liked. A Chicago paper had observed the previous September that Mrs. Vanderbilt has been unpopular socially for a long period. What she lost was access. But the sentence that matters most in that decree concerns the children. The care and custody of Consuelo, born the 2nd of March, 1877, of William Jr., born the 20th of October, 1878, and of Harold, born the 6th of July, 1884, were all awarded to Alva. And then this, in the court's own words, that the said 2 sons shall receive their education in the United States. This last provision, as to the education of the 2 sons, being made upon consent of both parties through their counsel in open court. Both parents stood up in a New York courtroom on the 5th of March, 1895, and agreed that the boys had to be educated in America. About the daughter, who had turned 18 3 days earlier, they said nothing at all. 8 months later, she was a duchess. Chapter 8. A steel rod runs down a child's back. There was a strap at the waist, a strap over each shoulder, and a 4th strap that ran from the forehead to the rod. Turn away from the woman for a moment and look at the child. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born on the 2nd of March, 1877, and named after her godmother, the friend who had introduced her parents. She grew up tall, quiet, and trilingual, reciting endless poems in French, German, and English to her mother every Saturday. In her 10th year, her music class gave a concert in honor of the parents, and she sang the farewell of Mary, Queen of Scots, to France with so much feeling that she burst into tears, and somebody threw her a bouquet, and she wrote in old age that no prima donna ever felt a greater thrill. She also wrote this: "Sitting up straight was one of the crucial tests of ladylike behavior," she remembered. "A horrible instrument was devised which I had to wear when doing my lessons. It was a steel rod, which ran down my spine and was strapped at my waist and over my shoulders. Another strap went around my forehead to the rod. I had to hold my book high when reading, and it was almost impossible to write in so uncomfortable a position. Every retelling of that passage drops the fourth strap, and every retelling drops the sentence that comes next, which is the one that tells you who she was. However, she added, I probably owe my straight back to those many hours of discomfort. That is dry rather than bitter. Consuelo Vanderbilt spent her life declining to sound like a victim, and it is the single most important thing to hold on to about her, because the story that follows will keep trying to make her one. There was also a whip. We were the last to be subjected to a harsh parental discipline, she wrote. In my youth, children were to be seen, but not heard. Corporal punishment for minor delinquencies was frequently administered with a riding whip. I have a vivid memory of the last such lashing my legs received as I stood while my mother wielded her crop. Being the elder, I had the privilege of the first taste of the whip. Willie followed, frequently administered, and the last such lashing, which means she was dating the end of a practice rather than describing a single afternoon. The occasion, when she tells it, was almost unbearably small. She and her brother had been sailing a toy boat on a pond. Their governess wanted them home, and they had not wanted to go. And then the line everybody knows, which is nearly always quoted wrong. Consuelo wrote that her mother informed her that I had no taste and that my opinions were not worth listening to. She brooked no contradiction. And when once I replied, I thought I was doing right, she stated. I do not ask you to think. I do the thinking. You do as you are told. The half of the sentence that gets dropped is the opening clause. The half that gets dropped even more often is the tag Consuelo put on the end of it, which reduced me to imbecility. And then, in the very next breath, in the same paragraph, she wrote this about the same woman. Her dynamic energy and her quick mind, together with her varied interests, made her a delightful companion. That is the difficulty at the center of this story, and any account that resolves it is lying. Consuelo Vanderbilt called her mother a born dictator, who dominated events about her as thoroughly as she eventually dominated her husband and her children, and who, if she admitted another point of view, never conceded it. She wrote that they were pawns in her game to be moved as her wishes decreed. She wrote that the bane of her life and of those who shared it was a violent temper that, like a tempest, at times engulfed them all. She also called her a delightful companion, and she meant it. Her father barely appears. Consuelo describes him as so invariably kind, so gentle and sweet to me, and then, in the same passage, notes that he played only a small part in our lives. It was invariably our mother, she wrote, who dominated our upbringing, our education, our recreation, and our thoughts. By the spring of 1895, 3 days before her mother's divorce decree was signed, Consuelo turned 18. She was tall enough that the question of her height would shortly become a problem for a dressmaker. And she was in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford, and she never once writes it down. Across the entire memoir, she calls him X and only X. She was writing in 1952. He had died in 1944. His widow and his children were alive, and she would not put his name in a book. He was 33 to her 18, and by the standards of the world they both moved in, he was more than acceptable. He was a descendant of Peter Stuyvesant and of John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, and twice a great-grandson of a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was, in the strictest sense, exactly the old blood that Mrs. Astor had spent 2 decades protecting from people like Alva. There was an understanding between them. The canonical record would later call it a secret engagement. Consuelo never uses the word engaged, only that she meant to marry him. Her mother found out, and the way she found out is better than any invented version. Despairing of ever seeing him, Consuelo wrote, "I had succumbed to despondency when at a ball we met. We had one short dance before my mother dragged me away, but it was enough to reassure me that his feelings towards me had not changed. Driving home, my mother observed an ominous silence, but when we reached the house, she told me to follow her to her room. One dance, a silent carriage, a door at the top of the stairs. Inside that room, Consuelo told her mother that she meant to marry him and that she considered she had a right to choose her own husband, and she recorded afterward that these were the bravest words she had ever uttered. They brought down a frightful storm of protest. I suffered every searing reproach," she wrote, "heard every possible invective hurled at the man I loved. I was informed of his numerous flirtations, of his well-known love for a married woman, of his desire to marry an heiress. My mother even declared that he would have no children and that there was madness in his family. 4 accusations delivered to an 18-year-old about a man she loved, numerous flirtations, a married woman, a fortune hunter, sterility and hereditary insanity. None of them was ever substantiated by anybody. Winthrop Rutherford went on to father 7 children, and the 3rd accusation is worth sitting with for a moment because of what happens next. Alva told her daughter that the man she loved wanted to marry an heiress. Chapter 9. She says she will shoot him and hang for it. They argued all night, and Consuelo left her mother in the cold dawn of morning, feeling as if all her youth had been drained away. The setting was Marble House, in the summer of 1895, 500,000 cubic feet of marble, 36 servants, and a girl of 18 who could not get a message out of the building. I could not seek counsel with X, she wrote, for there was no telephone. I could not write, for the servants had orders to bring my letters to my mother. Neither could I get past the porter at the gate. That is the actual architecture of what happened, and it is more chilling than the version usually told. She was never locked in a room. The doors were open. There was simply no way for anything to leave the house without passing through her mother's hands. Every account that says she was imprisoned makes the mistake of reaching for a bolt. There was no bolt. There was a standing order to the staff, a man on the gate, and no telephone. She was not locked in. She was cut off. In the room that night, when Consuelo would not give way, her mother went further than she had ever gone. It was perhaps my unexpected resistance, Consuelo wrote, or the mere fact that no one had ever stood up to her, that made her say she would not hesitate to shoot a man whom she considered would ruin my life. That is the memoir version, written 57 years later. The sworn version, given under oath to a church tribunal in 1926, is worse. There was a terrible scene, Consuelo testified, in which she told me that if I succeeded in escaping, she would shoot my sweetheart, and she would therefore be imprisoned and hanged, and I would be responsible. Notice the escalation. The memoir has a threat to shoot a man. The sworn version has a machine. He dies. Alva hangs for it. And the guilt for both deaths is assigned in advance, out loud, to a girl of 18 who has been told she may choose freely. They argued until it was light, and Consuelo went to her room feeling as if all her youth had been drained away. What followed the next morning is the part of this story that is almost always told wrong, and the true version is colder than the invention. No one came near me, Consuelo wrote, and the morning dragged on its interminable course. The house was full of ominous rumors. I heard that my mother was ill and in her bed, that a doctor had been sent for. Even my governess, usually so calm, was harassed. The suspense was becoming unbearable. Later that day, a visitor came up to her room. Mrs. William J. was Alva's intimate friend and was staying in the house. And she is a figure worth pausing on because she is at every hinge of this family's life. Her husband had been of counsel in Alva's divorce 4 months earlier. Her husband and Alva's husband had been on equally good terms for years. She and her husband had been sent, the previous summer, to try to reconcile the Vanderbilts, and had ended by helping broker the terms of the separation. She would be a corroborating witness at the annulment 31 years later. That afternoon, she came to tell an 18-year-old girl that her mother had suffered a heart attack, brought on by her daughter's callous indifference. She confirmed my mother's intentions of never consenting to my plans for marriage, Consuelo wrote, and her resolve to shoot X should I decide to run away with him. I asked her if I could see my mother, and whether, in her opinion, she would ever relent. I still remember the terrible answer. "Your mother will never relent," Mrs. J. said, "and I warn you there will be a catastrophe if you persist. The doctor has said that another scene may easily bring on a heart attack, and he will not be responsible for the result. You can ask the doctor yourself if you do not believe me. It has become customary to say that Alva faked it. The record does not say that. Consuelo does not say it, and the tribunal did not find it, and this documentary will not claim it. What Consuelo says is that she believed it. Still under the strain of the painful scene with my mother," she wrote, still seeing her frightening rage, "it seemed to me that she might indeed easily suffer a stroke or a heart attack if further provoked. In utter misery, I asked Mrs. J. to let X know that I could not marry him. Alva Vanderbilt needed only to be believed, and she arranged, through her closest friend and a doctor, that her daughter would be told twice in one afternoon that refusing her might kill her. There was a second lie in circulation that summer, and this one is in the tribunal's findings rather than in the memoir, which means it is Consuelo's sworn word rather than her recollection. Her mother told her that Winthrop Rutherford had jilted her. That is worse than the smears, because the smears asked her to think less of him. This asked her to believe he had stopped wanting her. And then, when the threats had done their work, somebody finished the job with kindness. How sad were those summer days of disgrace and unhappiness, Consuelo wrote. My mother turned away from me, my father out of reach, my brothers engrossed in their personal pleasures. My friends, who had wearied of being rebuffed, no longer called, and with an ingrained reticence, I kept my worries to myself. How gratefully then I looked to Miss Harper for consolation and advice. Miss Harper was her English governess, and Miss Harper did not threaten anybody. She spoke of the future awaiting her in her own country, of the opportunities for usefulness and social service she would find there, of the happiness a life lived for others can bring. And in such gentle appeals to my better nature, Consuelo wrote, she slowly swung me from contemplations of a purely personal nature to a higher idealism. The whip could not do it. The threat could not do it. Quite. What finished it was an Englishwoman explaining to a defeated girl that being sold could be reframed as a vocation. Brought up to obey, Consuelo wrote, I surrendered more easily to my mother's dictates than others nurtured in a gentler discipline might have done. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, arrived at Newport in September and stayed a fortnight. He was 23. He had inherited at 20 on the sudden death of his father, and what he had inherited was a palace of 187 rooms and an estate that had spent 20 years selling itself off in pieces. Since 1875, Blenheim had sold the Marlborough gems for £35,000 and the Sunderland Library, nearly 21,000 volumes, for 56,000 more. On a single day in August of 1884, It sold a Raphael to the National Gallery for £70,000 and a Van Dyck for £17,500. It sold a group of Rubens' self-portraits to a Rothschild for £55,000. In 1886, it put 936 further lots through Christie's and had to buy £15,000 worth back in because the market would not meet the reserves. American grain had broken the English aristocracy, and now American money was buying what was left of it. The Duke's own father had already tried this solution, marrying an American widow in 1888, spending her money on the palace and dying. His widow then sued her stepson to get it back. The 9th Duke was repeating his father's arrangement in the same generation for a larger sum. Alva gave a ball for him at Marble House that was described in the papers as the most beautiful fete ever seen in Newport. She had chosen the cotillion favours herself, in Paris. Old French etchings, fans, mirrors, watch cases, ribbons, all of the period of Louis XIV. There were lanterns made as facsimiles of Marble House and bagpipes that really squeaked. Every favour was stamped with a medallion of the house. Guests danced under a roof paid for by a Vanderbilt and went home carrying small models of the building in which a girl was about to be sold. He proposed a few evenings later, quietly, indoors. It was in the comparative quiet of an evening at home, Consuelo wrote, that Marlborough proposed to me in the Gothic room, whose atmosphere was so propitious to sacrifice. There was no need for sentiment. I was content with his pious hope that he would make me a good husband, and ran up to my mother with word of our engagement. There was no time for thought or for regrets. The next day, the news was out. A few days after that, the Duke left, announcing on his way that he would never revisit the country. There was in his sarcastic comments on all things American and arrogance, Consuelo noted, that inclined me to view his decision with approval. Chapter 10. The great houses stand boarded up along the route. On the morning of her wedding, the bride's own family homes on Fifth Avenue were shuttered, and the bridal carriages drove past every one of them. The settlement had been signed the day before. 5 people gathered in a room at Alva's new house on East 72nd Street at about 11 in the morning on the 5th of November. The bride's father and his attorney, the Duke and his attorney, and the bride. Alva was in the house. She stayed out of the room. William Kissam Vanderbilt, who had never once set foot in his former wife's new home, arrived by carriage, greeted his daughter affectionately, and sat down to trade. It took 1.5 hours. Then an 18-year-old girl signed. What she signed away is worth stating precisely, because it has been garbled for a century. 50,000 shares of Beech Creek Railroad stock went into a trust, valued at $2.5 million, carrying a guaranteed dividend of 4% from the New York Central. That dividend came to $100,000 a year, and it was payable to the Duke for his life, then to Consuelo for hers, then to whichever of her sons inherited the title. Separately, her father covenanted to pay $100,000 a year for as long as both he and she lived, and bound his executors to settle a further $2.5 million on her within a year of his death. $2.5 million in 1895 is about $96 million in today's consumer prices. Measured against what people actually earned, it is closer to $900 million. Measured as a share of the American economy, over $4.5 billion. And Consuelo Vanderbilt controlled none of it. The income went to her husband. The capital went to a future duke. Her father's money went to trustees. She was, on paper, one of the wealthiest young women alive, and she could not send a letter without her mother reading it first. She spent the morning of her wedding alone. I spent the morning of my wedding day in tears and alone, she wrote. No one came near me. A footman had been posted at the door of my apartment, and not even my governess was admitted. Like an automaton, I donned the lovely lingerie. There is a story that she wept behind her veil at the altar. The weeping happened earlier than that, and somewhere worse. In a room in her mother's house on 72nd Street, with a servant standing outside the door before anybody saw her. "We were 20 minutes late," she wrote, "for my eyes, swollen with the tears I had wept, required copious sponging before I could face the curious. Her eyes had to be sponged down so that the crowd would not know." And there was a crowd. They had begun arriving outside St. Thomas Church at 9 in the morning, 3 hours before the ceremony, prepared for a long siege, carrying camp stools, opera glasses, and lunch done up in paper bags. 200 police officers, 4 sergeants, a captain, and 4 roundsmen were needed to hold the avenue. A separate detail of 55 men and a dozen detectives held a line 150 feet out around Alva's house. The sidewalks were fairly black with people, the Tribune wrote, and the crowd was mostly women. Women in tattered dresses, some with babies in their arms, contended with fashionably dressed women for places of advantage. Inside, the church had been turned into a conservatory, 100,000 roses and chrysanthemums, several tons of ice packed into the basement to keep them alive. The florist, asked what it had cost, refused to say. The florist was instructed to go ahead and do his best. Some of the rarest orchids in the church were rented and would be used again at other people's weddings. Now picture the drive, because it is the shot that holds this entire film. The route ran down 5th Avenue, and on the right, in the glory of a bright, sunshiny morning, stood the great Vanderbilt palaces, gloomy and deserted. Cornelius Vanderbilt's house was closed, the windows hidden behind shutters, not a face to be seen. And between that house and the church stood the house at 52nd Street, also boarded up. It has stood practically deserted, the Tribune noted, since Mr. and Mrs. William Kissam Vanderbilt separated. That was 665th Avenue, the White House on the brown street. The house she had built to be seen from 3 blocks off. The house where 12 years earlier 100 costumed millionaires had processed down a staircase beneath her portrait, while a crowd stood in the March cold to watch. Her daughter's bridal carriage drove past it with the shutters closed. If you had been standing in that crowd on 5th Avenue that morning, you would have seen a girl in white in a carriage and nothing else. The dark house behind her was the whole story, and not one person in the street could read it. There were no Vanderbilts inside the church either. Not one person bearing the name attended, except the bride's father, her 2 brothers, and her mother. Chauncey Depew, the closest friend the family had, was cut for taking her father's side in the divorce. Mr. and Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt stayed at the Breakers in Newport for the day. The boarded-up doors of the other Vanderbilt houses, the Sun wrote, were full of meaning. Miss Consuelo was to become the Duchess with none of her own blood to bid her Godspeed, excepting only her parents and her brothers. The bridegroom, incidentally, arrived on time. It was the bride who was late. The bells rang noon, and no bridal party came. At 12:15, the murmuring began. A dozen false alarms went round the church. The Duke stood at the chancel, and the Tribune's man watched his face go almost ashen white while he toyed with his moustache and stroked his chin and tried to look unconcerned. His cousin, who was standing beside him as best man, was evidently enjoying the embarrassing position, for he smiled and looked thoroughly happy. And from somewhere high up in the balcony, in a sudden hush, a woman's voice was heard to say, "Oh, will she never come?" She came at 16 minutes past 12, on her father's arm. Her white dress, all shimmer and lace, with its long train and clinging veil, seemed too heavy for the frail form that drooped under it, the Sun reported. The girl's head was bent forward so that, tall as she is, her father towered over her. She looked frail and pale and pathetically girlish. Her veil carried a piece of Point d'Angleterre lace that her grandmother of Mobile had worn at her own wedding, and that her mother had worn at Calvary Church 20 years before. It was the one thing that had survived the collapse of that family intact, carried through a war and a bankruptcy and 3 descending addresses, and it went up the aisle of St. Thomas Church on a girl who was being traded for a title. The train was 5 yards long. It had been made to the specifications the Queen laid down for presentation at the Court of St. James's, because it was going to be needed for that. The dress was built for the job. Her father walked beside her with a set, almost defiant expression, his eyes fixed with military exactness. He passed the woman who bears his name, the son wrote, without a glance in her direction, and Alva sat calm and expressionless throughout the ceremony. Only those in the front seats heard the girl say, "I will," so faint was it. There is one more thing in the record, and honesty requires it, because it complicates everything. On the walk back down the aisle to the Tannhauser March, the Duke turned to his wife halfway down and said something in a low voice that brought a quick smile to her face, and she kept looking about happily and smiling to her friends, who nodded their congratulations as she passed. Whatever had been done to her, she was 18 years old, and for a few minutes, on a November morning, she smiled. Her mother smiled once too. Mrs. Vanderbilt sat calm and expressionless, the son recorded. Only once did she show any change of expression, and that was when the Duchess of Marlborough came down the chancel steps on the Duke's arm. Then Mrs. Vanderbilt smiled. Her father did not stay. Instead of returning to the house, he kept right on going, emerged into the street by a side door, and walked away down the avenue. Outside, 4,000 or 5,000 people made one grand rush at the house, and it is safe to say that not 1 in 500 saw the bride. When the carriage pulled away, 4 old slippers were thrown after it, and 50 or 60 women, some of them grey-haired, fought over them in the middle of the street. And in the newspaper list of wedding presents printed the following morning, between a golden mesh purse from Mrs. William Astor and a silver tray from the Vanderbilt household servants, there is one line: Winthrop Rutherford, a pair of antique silver candlesticks. Chapter 11. She marries in a travelling dress at 10:15. 2 months after selling her daughter to a duke, Alva Vanderbilt married the man she actually wanted in her own drawing room, in front of almost nobody. There was no church. There was no Fifth Avenue. On the 11th of January, 1896, at 10:15 in the morning, at her own house on East 72nd Street, the mayor of New York performed a civil ceremony. The witnesses were Colonel William J. and William Dewar, the 2 men who had been of counsel in her divorce. Her sister was there. Her sons Harold, aged 11, and William Jr., aged 15, were there. The groom wore a black frock coat. The bride wore a travelling gown of sorrel green cloth, trimmed with black. Neither the Vanderbilt nor the Belmont family officially attended. They were on a train at 1:02, going to Newport. The woman who had staged the most photographed evening in American history got married at breakfast time in a dress meant for a railway carriage, with a politician officiating, and left town within 3 hours. She had built her entire adult life out of spectacle, and when she finally got the thing she actually wanted, she took it as privately as it was possible to take anything. Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont was 37, and he was the strangest man in this story. His father was August Belmont, the Hessian-born financier who had been the Rothschilds' agent in America. His mother was the daughter of Commodore Matthew Perry, which is where his names came from. He served exactly 1 term in Congress and declined to run again. He published a weekly paper. He drove 4 in-hand carriages better than almost anyone in America. His first marriage collapsed on the honeymoon. His wife left him in Paris. A daughter was born the following September, and Oliver disowned the child and claimed she was not his. The girl died of a gas leak in her sleep in 1908, a few months after her own wedding. In the same year, her father died. And he had built Belcourt. Richard Morris Hunt designed it for him at Newport between 1891 and 1894, modelled on the Louis XIII hunting lodge at Versailles. 60 rooms, 50,000 square feet, $3,200,000, which is the best documented cost figure in this entire family's history. Newport's third largest house after the Breakers and Ochre Court. The entire first floor was stables, not a garage, not a carriage porch. Stables and carriage rooms, occupying the whole ground floor of a $3 million mansion because he liked horses more than he liked people. He put in the first standing shower in Newport. He had the walls of his bedroom painted with scenes of the life of a nobleman, and he built the house, according to the record, partly as a rebuke. He harboured a disdain for the newly wealthy and viewed their ostentatious displays with contempt, which is why Belcourt deliberately hides its grandeur from Bellevue Avenue. He built a 60-room palace as a criticism of showing off, and then married the most conspicuous woman in America. He very nearly did not see it finished. Belcourt was due to open on the 4th of July, 1894, and stayed shut because Belmont was in a New York hospital, having been mugged. It was a full year before he set foot in his own completed house. Alva moved in and set about it immediately. She converted the carriage room into a banquet hall and turned a study into a boudoir, importing 18th century French panelling for it. She had been altering buildings since she was 26 years old, and she was not going to stop for a stable. They had 12 years. They are, on the evidence, the only 12 happy years in this story, and the record of them is thin precisely because nothing went wrong. There were no lawsuits, no sealed decrees, no threats, no tribunals. 2 people who had wanted each other for at least 4 years before they could say so lived in 2 enormous houses and drove very good horses. On the 1st of June, 1908, Oliver Belmont developed appendicitis. The doctors found his heart in such condition that there was much hesitation before a decision to operate was reached. They operated at last, and he rallied nicely. On the Saturday the 6th, though the day was rainy and the air raw, he went down to Belmont Park to watch the running of the stakes race named for his father. Then peritonitis set in, and he died at 34 minutes past 6 in the morning on the 10th of June at Brookholt, the Long Island house she had built after the divorce. He had gone to the races in the rain, and 4 days later he was dead. She was 55 years old. Her daughter was in England, separated from a duke and barred from Blenheim. Her sons were grown. The man she had wrecked a marriage and a reputation for was gone in 9 days. She left the country while the estate was settled and stayed away for a year. And when she came back, in 1909, she came back to a house on Madison Avenue that she had commissioned before he died, and that was now finished without him. Its largest room was an exact reproduction of the Gothic room at Belcourt, 85 feet long and 24 wide, and she had built it for one purpose. It was a hall to hold a dead man's suits of armour. Chapter 12. She fills a hall of armour with suffragists. The largest room in her new house was an exact copy of a Gothic hall from Belcourt, 85 feet long, built to hold a dead man's medieval armour. In August of 1909, sitting in a hotel in New York, Alva Belmont told a reporter what she intended to do with it. "Since the house has been started," she said, "I have become an ardent suffragist. and it seemed to me that I could serve the cause in no better way than by providing a large hall in which prominent suffragists might lecture during the winter. She built a memorial to her husband's armour collection and filled it with women demanding the vote. That is documented rather than inferred, and it is the cleanest image of the second half of her life. What she brought to the movement was the only instrument she had ever used. Money and publicity, in that order, applied without embarrassment. She started at Newport because Newport was hers. On the 24th of August, 1909, she threw open Marble House to the public for the first time in its history. $5 bought a card admitting the holder to see the interior of the house and hear the lecture. $1 bought the lecture only in a large tent pitched on the lawn beneath the marble terrace. Until the present, she told the papers, I have always thought it best not to open Marble Palace to public view, as it has been used solely for a private residence, though I should very much have liked to please the many sincere admirers of art who have in former years made application for such a privilege. I am departing from that rule of years solely because I believe the step may tend to increase the votes of women. 800 people came. An orchestra played on the long terrace. A flag flew with 4 white stars on it, one for each state that had so far given women the vote. Postcards printed with a picture of the house were on sale inside the grounds, and a score of uniformed policemen patrolled the grounds against the hunger of souvenir hunters. And Julia Ward Howe, who had written the battle hymn of the Republic, drove over at the age of 89, took a seat on the stage, was not advertised as a speaker, and spoke anyway. It resembled a circus day about Marble House this afternoon, the Sun reported. A syndicated columnist sneered at it in at least 4 papers. The woman's suffrage movement has been made fashionable, he wrote. It has invaded the ranks of the 400, where it divides honours with bridge whist and monkey dinners. He had noticed everything except the fact that it worked. She was selling tickets to look at her own drawing room while still refusing to allow it to be photographed, and every dollar went to the campaign. In 1883, she had handed reporters a costume list and given them no supper. In 1909, she sold the public a $5 ticket and gave them no photographs. It is one technique, 26 years apart. Then she bought the machinery. She paid the rent on an entire floor of an office building at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street for the National Suffrage Association, on one condition, that they move their headquarters out of Ohio and into New York. She furnished the offices of the press committee and paid its rent and the salaries of 3 workers at $600 a month, and in one 7-month stretch she put more than $3,000 into the press bureau alone, against a full year running cost of about $2,600. She was overfunding it deliberately. By 1912, that bureau was sending out 2,000 copies of its bulletin every week to the Associated Press, United Press, and half the newspaper syndicates in America. She had bought the movement a printing press, which is what she had wanted for herself since 1883. And in December of 1909, she did something that has almost nothing to do with any of that. The shirtwaist makers of New York went on strike. Alva Belmont rented the Hippodrome and paid the bill, and between 7,000 and 8,000 people filled it. 2 weeks later, on the 19th of December, 4 striking girls were arrested on a picket line, and she went down to the Jefferson Market Night Court to bail them out, and she stayed there until nearly dawn. The judge asked whether the property she was offering was sufficient security. "I think it is," she replied. "It is valued at $400,000. There may be a mortgage on it for $100,000. She put up her own house, worth $400,000, with $300,000 of equity in it, as bail for 4 factory girls whose names she did not know. and she sat in a police court from 9 at night until 3 in the morning to do it, more than once. Magistrates complained that the generosity of women like Belmont emboldened picketers and prolonged the strike. She was 56 years old, and she had been received by Mrs. Astor. And then, in the spring of 1914, she wrote a check that has to be told alongside it. She sent $10,000 on condition that the gift be kept secret to a Southern conference organized to secure the vote for white women alone on the principle of states' rights. She defended it in public in Chattanooga, in words the movement's own official history recorded. "I plead guilty to so strong a desire for the political emancipation of women," she said, "that I am not at all particular as to how it shall be granted." 4 years earlier, she had done the opposite. In February of 1910, her carriage drew up under the elevated railroad in West 53rd Street, and she walked into the Mount Olivet Baptist Church to found the first black branch of her own suffrage association, and the pastor told the meeting it was the first time in the history of the Negro race in this country that such a thing had happened. She promised them rooms of their own once they reached 100 members, and when they reached 100, she gave them a headquarters in Harlem. By October of the following year, she had lost interest, and the woman running it remarked on the club's loneliness. Both of those things belong in the account. The woman who bailed out strikers and opened a Harlem branch is the same woman who funded a whites-only campaign in secret, and her own explanation covers all of it. She was not at all particular as to how it should be granted. It is the identical logic that had put her daughter on a boat to England, applied to a different question. The end of her first suffrage career came in December of 1913, and it is the exact shape of 1883 all over again. At the National Convention in Washington, she moved that the headquarters she had personally paid to establish be relocated to the Capitol. A motion to lay her proposal on the table was made immediately, and all discussion was cut off. The vote was 134 for and 169 against. The organization she had bought and furnished told her to sit down. So she walked out and financed the other one. Alice Paul, then almost unknown, had written to her and been ignored. Then a telephone message came asking Paul to dinner and to stay the night. Mrs. Belmont did not like to go to bed until very, very late, and they talked until 2 in the morning. And by the end of it, she had decided that these were the people who would put the amendment through, and that everything else was insanity. She cut off all her old connections that night. At Marble House the following August, she stood at the back of a meeting and gave them $5,000, which Paul remembered as the biggest gift they had ever had. "It seemed to us enormous," Paul said. And it was, for us. She also gave them their name. They had been the Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage, and she asked them to change it because, she said, it has so much more strength and more dignity, and for future times it will be a stronger, bigger name. They became the National Woman's Party. She was 61, and she had just done, for the second time in her life, the only thing she knew how to do. Told that she did not belong, she went and built the rival institution. Chapter 13. She tells a court in Rome exactly what she did. In 1895, Alva Vanderbilt commanded her daughter to marry a man she did not love, and in 1926 she said so, in writing, to a tribunal that had no power to punish her for it. The marriage had gone the way everybody could have predicted. Consuelo produced 2 sons, and Queen Victoria telegraphed her congratulations from Balmoral on the birth of an heir. At Blenheim, husband and wife ate dinner in silence in a palace of 187 rooms, whose great library had stood an emptied shell since the books were auctioned. "How I learned to dread and hate these dinners," Consuelo wrote. How ominous and wearisome they loomed at the end of a long day. Once a course had been passed, the servants withdrew to the hall and the door was closed. Her husband would pile food on his plate, push the plate away with all the cutlery and glasses, back his chair from the table, cross one leg over the other, and endlessly twirl the ring on his little finger. After a quarter of an hour, he would return to earth and begin to eat very slowly, usually complaining that the food was cold. As a rule, neither of us spoke a word, she wrote. I took to knitting in desperation, and the butler read detective stories in the hall. She was going deaf in her 20s and travelled to specialists on the continent, and her husband habitually remained behind, enjoying the gay life of the metropolis. They separated in October of 1906, and King Edward VII personally intervened to ask for at least the appearance of a reconciliation, and she refused him. The king was quoted as saying that she displayed incredible obstinacy in holding out for a separation. The girl who could not refuse her mother in 1895 refused a king in 1906. She was banished from court for 6 years for it, and only restored when Queen Alexandra went over Queen Mary's objections in 1912. The civil divorce came in November of 1920, made absolute the following May, on evidence so obviously arranged that the whole hearing took 25 minutes. Then in 1925, Consuelo petitioned the Catholic Church to declare that the marriage had never existed at all. She was the petitioner, not the Duke. He opposed it at first, until it was explained to him that his 2 sons would not be made illegitimate. The ground, she pleaded, was force and fear, and the strongest evidence against Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. She gave a deposition. This is what she said. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I always had an absolute influence over my daughter, my children having been entirely committed to me after my divorce. I had had their education solely in my own hands. When I gave an order, no one argued. Therefore, I did not ask her. I commanded her to marry the Duke. I then invited the Duke to visit me at Newport. He came and he stayed about a fortnight. Then I told my daughter that he was the man I had chosen for her. She was completely overcome and replied that she could not marry him. I considered that I was justified in overriding her opposition as simply the folly of an inexperienced girl. The tribunal found that every sort of constraint, pushed even to physical violence, had been employed to attain her end. And then it printed, in the middle of its own reasoning, one parenthesis, which is the whole of this story. The confession of those who caused the fear being preferable to all other testimony. The church believed her because she had nothing to gain by saying it. In a life spent manufacturing the account of herself, the one document that stands up in a court of law is the one that convicts her, and it stands up precisely because she wrote it against her own interest. The decree was signed in August of 1926. It reached the newspapers in November, and the scandal was enormous, and almost none of it fell on the woman who had confessed. The Bishop of Southwark, who had signed it, explained the finding to a London paper without softening a syllable. The marriage of the Duke of Marlborough and Consuelo Vanderbilt was declared null because through fear she did not give her willing, but only her unwilling, consent to the contract. Therefore there never was a marriage contract, and though they may have lived together for over 20 years, they were never married. 25 years of a life, unwritten by a sentence. From the pulpit of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, Bishop William Manning called the whole proceeding an unwarrantable intrusion and an impertinence. That any woman of middle age, after years of married life, should be willing to swear that her parents sold her for worldly gain, and against her will, he said, is in itself a scandal. He also produced witnesses. Many who were present at the marriage, he said, have informed me that they saw no sign whatever that the bride was acting under any compulsion, but quite to the contrary. He was right about that. The newspapers of 1895 recorded a bride who smiled on the way back down the aisle. Both things happened. A girl can be broken in private in August and smile in public in November, and one does not cancel the other. And the fact that a room full of people saw nothing is exactly what her mother had spent the summer arranging. In Rome, Vatican officials refused to discuss the case and indicated that the publicity had become so distasteful that steps had been taken to keep any further decisions of that tribunal out of the press. The Duke isolated himself at Blenheim and saw no one. Consuelo said nothing publicly at all, and Alva, asked to comment 9 days before the findings broke, gave the only statement she ever made about the thing she had done to her daughter. She called it merely one of those adjustments that come into the lives of people. Then she asked to be excused. She was in the middle of packing. She sailed for France on the day the sentence was published and took her meals alone at a small table, avoided the other passengers, and spent a great deal of time by herself in the salon, reading. At Cherbourg, a reporter got to her. She was 73. "I do not care what you or anyone else says," she told him. "Who are you coming to bother me? I do not want to talk to you or any of your people." Chapter 14. She writes her own funeral and tells them why. She handed Alice Paul a document and said that nobody ever pays any attention to the death of a woman who has made a great gift to her country. Any man who has been in the public eye, she told Paul in France, gets a public ceremony when he dies. She had written out directions for her own, and she wanted Paul to take them to her lawyer, and she was blunt about why she was asking her. "If you do not do it," she said, "then I will not have it done, because I do not know of anybody else who will." Paul kept a second copy in a vault in Washington. She died in Paris at 10 minutes to 7 in the morning on the 26th of January 1933, at her house in the Rue Monsieur. She had turned 89 days earlier. There had been 2 strokes the previous year. She was conscious at the end, and she said nothing. The woman who spent 50 years making certain she was quoted died without a last word. Her daughter was in the room. Her 2 sons were not. One was in New York and one was on a yacht. Of the 3 children of that marriage, the only one at the bedside was the one she had broken. They brought her home on a liner, and she lay in state in a side chapel at St. Thomas Church under a blanket of violets sent by her children, guarded day and night by women holding banners. And on the 12th of February, 1933, she gave her last party. It was at St. Thomas Church, on the corner where her daughter had been married 37 years before. The building itself had burned down in 1905 and been rebuilt. So the room was different, but the corner was the same, and everybody in it knew what had happened there. Only one man took any part in the service. The rector read it. Everything else was done by women because she had instructed that it should be. 20 honorary pallbearers walked ahead of the coffin. The published roll of them ran to nearly 40 names, and one magazine said it might well have served as the roster of a feminine hall of fame. Jane Addams was on it. So were Amelia Earhart, a United States Senator, Christabel Pankhurst, and Margaret Sanger. 200 women in mantles of white and purple carried 2 sets of banners, the party's own tricolours, and 48 state flags, one for every state in the Union. As the cortege moved down the centre aisle, the standard-bearers went down the side aisles like knights or acolytes in an ancient ritual and stood at vigil for the entire service, forming a cordon the full length of the church. There was a touch of black on each staff as a reminder. There was no half-masting of anything. A tenor sang a hymn, and the words of it had been written by the woman in the coffin. Weep, ah, weep no more, for a soul has risen today, a daughter of the king. And at the head of the casket, held in full view of the congregation for the whole of the service because she had specifically asked for it, was the actual banner that women had carried at the gates of the White House through the Wilson administration. It bore 3 words, and they were Susan Anthony's last public words, spoken a month before she died. Failure is impossible. Among the mourners who filed past the coffin were women of the bench and the bar, doctors, writers, and former strikers from the New York shirtwaist factories, who had found in Mrs. Belmont a valiant champion of their rights in a great crisis. 50 years after a party at which the guests spent $155,730 on fancy dress, the mourners included the factory girls she had bailed out of Night Court. They buried her the same day at Woodlawn, in a mausoleum built as an exact replica of the chapel of St. Hubert at Amboise, where Leonardo da Vinci is said to lie. The ground was blanketed in snow. Besides her own family, only Alice Paul went inside the vault, carrying a banner in purple, white, and gold, which she laid on the casket. 4 young women played taps. Look at what that life actually turned on. A card left at a door, to prove a family existed. A costume list handed to reporters, so that a continent would print her version. A decree signed by a judge, which freed her and left her husband unable to marry. An indenture bound in a volume 4 feet square, which an 18-year-old signed in 90 minutes. A decree of nullity from Rome, which unwrote 25 years of that girl's life on the strength of her mother's own confession. And a set of funeral instructions, written out by hand, so that somebody would pay attention when a woman died. 6 pieces of paper, and every one of them decided who somebody was. Of the 7 great houses she built or commissioned, 4 are gone. 665th Avenue, the White House on the Brown Street, was demolished in 1927, while she was still alive. The Hall of Armour came down in 1951. The house in Washington that carries her name is now a national monument, and she never once walked through its door. She was to have sailed from Paris for the dedication, and could not, and the ceremony was postponed, and she never came. She died still funding a constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal rights, which she had watched launched from a pulpit at Seneca Falls in 1923, and which has still not passed. And there is one more piece of paper. In 1952, at 75, Consuelo Vanderbilt published her memoirs. She described the funeral in them. She wrote about the strangeness of being met in New York by policemen on motorcycles who preceded the hearse with screeching sirens while they raced to St. Thomas Church. She wrote that the service there was triumphantly symbolic, with the suffrage societies flying their banners as they came up the aisle wave upon wave. She noted, dryly, that the hymn her mother had composed naturally concerned a woman. And then, sometime after the book was already in print, she went back into it and added one sentence. It was only fitting, she wrote, that such tribute should be paid to the courage she had shown in braving popular prejudice and established custom to secure better conditions for women the world over. That is the warmest thing Consuelo Vanderbilt ever said about her mother, and it is not something she felt in 1933 and wrote down. It is something she decided, later, after publication, ought to be there. She went back into her own book, the one place in the world where she had the last word, and she made it kinder. Alva Vanderbilt spent her whole life deciding what other people were, on paper. She wrote her own coverage, she wrote her own funeral, and the one book she tried to write about herself was never published, so that everything we have of her voice comes second-hand through somebody else's carbon copy. The final account of her was written by the daughter she sold. She had said it herself 60 years earlier, in a rented house in New York, as a rule for living. You cannot help your children to advantages through sentimental romance, but through money, which alone has power. And a woman who lived in her house at Newport in 1917 once watched her come home from a bridge party, throw her gloves on the table, and say that she loathed those people. Asked why she went, she said she was determined to keep her position among them. Asked why she loathed them, she said they cared for nothing but money, and when it was put to her that she had a great deal of money herself, she looked at the woman fiercely. "Surely I have," she said. "Money is power." She was right about that. She had been right about it since she was 18. But on the night she finally proved it, on Easter Monday in 1883, there was a crowd standing in the cold on Fifth Avenue outside a white stone house, watching strangers arrive dressed as kings. And 4 days later, a Massachusetts paper that had counted the guests and worked out how the coverage was made looked at the hostess in her jeweled Venetian cap, costumed as a painting, and wrote one line about her that nobody has ever improved on. No one saw the woman herself. She was of no consequence. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because there are more lives like this one coming. And tell me something in the comments. If you had been Consuelo, standing in that room at Marble House with a guard at the door, and your mother telling you she would shoot the man you loved and hang for it, do you honestly believe you would have said no? I want to know.